We're going to talk about what has happened in Canada with Bill M103. This is a bill to fight Islamophobia. This is a bill to make it illegal to criticize Islam in certain ways. And opponents of the bill say this is just an attack on free speech. And Canada already had strict hate laws. And how much of a problem was Islamophobia anyway? Andrew Lawton wrote on the Washington Post, Canada's parliament wants to fight Islamophobia by killing free speech. And as Al Jazeera reports it, this non-binding motion, this is Bill or Act M103, tasked Canadian government with study to develop ways to address racism and discriminations. Let's sort out what's actually going on. Andrew, welcome to the Line of Fire. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here, Michael. Thanks for the invitation.
Andrew, as an American looking up at Canada and visiting there fairly often, it seems that Canadians are a bit less aggressive than Americans and less prone to some of the extreme positions you might find in America. But is there a big problem with Islamophobia in your country?
No, what there is a problem with liberal media outlets and liberal politicians manufacturing Islamophobia. Oftentimes, one of the big things, and we see this with the American left as well, but in Canada in particular, is that every single issue that happens is forced into this victim-oppressor narrative. And we've seen this where a lot of stories, including one in my town of London, Ontario, have been reported as Islamophobic, and then you find out later on that in some cases the Islamophobic incident was manufactured, or in other cases the motivation was different than Islamophobic hatred, but oftentimes there's no follow-up that expresses that.
All right, so you're going to get a skewed impression from the media. Now we have to do something about this terrible problem here. What about hate speech laws that are already on the books in Canada? How far do they go?
To be honest, the actual criminal code in Canada has a very high threshold for what constitutes hate speech, and that means you must be essentially threatening someone or threatening genocide for it to be a hate speech initiative. But we have underneath the criminal level a national network of human rights commissions and human rights codes, and these are a fair bit more liberal in nature. I mean, we had, up until a few years ago, a provision that actually allowed the government to prosecute anyone who was doing internet hate speech, and they went after bloggers. They went after Mark Stein, who a lot of American radio listeners will be very familiar with, and other people for saying things that were deemed to be offensive in those cases towards Muslims.
Yeah, and I know on a broader level, Andrew, that James Dobson's broadcast, when he used to be with Focus on the Family, with a Christian broadcast, when he was dealing with LGBT issues many years ago, before the T was even there, just homosexual issues some decades back, that when they broadcast in Canada, they had to remove some of the content because it wasn't going to be acceptable. So in that sense, there's been even less freedom of speech already in Canada. And what then motivated this move? Is it just the liberalism of Trudeau? Was it the attack in the mosque in Quebec? What's happened?
Well, it was actually put forward before the attack in the mosque in Quebec, but that attack did give a lot more political capital to it, so it made it very difficult for a lot of people to stand up and criticize this. Although Justin Trudeau's Liberals have a majority, there was never any doubt that the issue was going to pass. I think it was that they wanted a wedge issue that they could paint anyone in opposition to as a bigot, and that's precisely what they did on this, because in the actual motion itself, in M103, I have the full text in front of me, it says we need to quell the increasing public climate of hate and fear. There have been a couple of studies in the past couple of years that have looked at hate-motivated attacks, hate-motivated biases, even vandalism in Canada, and the actual rise we see is not in anti-Islamic attacks, but in anti-Semitism. We've had bomb threats on Jewish community centers as recently as about a month ago, and that's the increase. That's where we're seeing it. I'm not proposing I'm not proposing the government puts forward an anti-Semitism motion, but if we are going to have an honest discussion about where the bigotry is, that's where we have to have it.
Yeah, there's I've read reports, even leading universities, even in Toronto, where there were very extreme anti-Semitic comments, student leaders that held to those that wanted to push the BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. And this was just the norm. This was okay. Why is it then? I mean, what's going on? Why is it that you can have real, genuine hate speech and even incidents of vandalism and things like that are anti-Semitic in content, and that, well, it's disturbing, but you're not going to pass a motion to try to deal with it. But when it comes to Islam, there's this hypersensitivity. It doesn't make sense.
It's not just a hypersensitivity. It goes further than that. I mean, Muslims have, generally speaking, become the chosen victim group. Muslims and the LGBT community. The ultimate irony is that these are two groups that typically don't get along, but
Exactly.
both of them are generally held up by the left as sort of the model victims. And I can give you an example. When there was a vandalism of a mosque in Peterborough, Ontario, which is a smaller city, 2 years ago, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau flew to the mosque. He hopped on a plane, went there, and he gave a lecture about the dangers of fear, hatred, and division. Well, where was that support of the Jewish community when there was a swastika spray painted on the wall of one a few weeks ago? Where was the support of the Jewish community when an imam in Montreal got up and gave a lecture calling for death of the accursed Jews? Where was all of this when we've seen these anti-Semitic attacks? It hasn't existed.
Right. And you're talking about extreme speech, say, from an Islamic leader. I read those quotes as well. Now, with this motion M103, can you get on your radio show in London, Ontario, and speak freely about this? If ISIS commits an atrocity, if there is a radical mosque in your city or country, can you freely speak against these things, or are there repercussions?
Yes, I can, and legally I can. I mean, as far as sort of the cultural reaction, that's another issue altogether. Here's where people need to understand the nature of M103. So it is not a bill that has the binding force of law as censoring criticism of Muslims. But what it does do is it commits the government to tackling this, because one of the provisions of it was, in the text of the motion, a whole-of-government approach to curbing Islamophobia. And this process got underway about a week ago. The Parliament commissioned a committee to start looking into this. And what the bigger concern is what that committee will recommend, because we've already heard from one of the stakeholders on this that they are not going to exclude radical Muslim voices. One of the groups, the National Council of Canadian Muslims, has called for mandatory anti-Islamophobia education in public schools. They're going to have the right to weigh in on this. So my concern is that the government has started something with this. This is not the be-all and end-all. They've started what they want to be a top-down reform of how Islam is discussed in Canada.
And as far as the Islamic presence in Canada, what percentage of it, if you can quantify this, is radical? Are 99% of Muslims in the country so far from radical, so against the Muslim extremism that blows people up and things like that even any association with that is wrong and unfair to them, or is there a growing radical element within the nation?
There certainly is a growing radical element. I know of a number of cases where there have been young people, young Muslim boys, men that have been recruited and taken up arms for ISIS, some of which have gone over there. Our security agency actually had a report a couple of years ago that was looking at about 150 people that are overseas that have fought for ISIS, some of which have returned and haven't been charged with any crimes. I don't have a breakdown, but what I can tell you is that our so-called moderate mainstream Muslim organizations have a lot of radical views. One of the biggest, the Muslim Association of Canada, has on its website, this is in plain sight, support of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna. And al-Banna, who has founded the Brotherhood, which has committed numerous terrorist attacks around the world, also called for support of what Hitler was trying to do with eradication of the Jews. Another so-called mainstream moderate Muslim group, the National Council of Canadian Muslims, used to be called CARE-CAN. It was the Canadian chapter of CARE in the U.S., which I'm sure you're very familiar with its views and its overseas connections. So I don't know, as far as individual Muslims go, how many of them are radicals, but if we're looking at the moderate or so-called moderate groups as having direct ties to Muslim Brotherhood, to Hamas in some cases. I have a lot of skepticism that there is going to be a presence of the moderate, genuinely moderate voices in any national discussions about Islam.
Yeah, and the other question is, how come these so-called moderate voices don't work to out the extremists? Andrew, here in America, we had this surprising shift with Donald Trump being voted in as a conservative candidate, a surprise conservative and kind of an anti-establishment guy, but certainly a pushback against some of the radical liberalism of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. In Canada, you had Stephen Harper, a great friend of Israel, one of the most articulate friends of Israel in the world, and you swing in the way of Justin Trudeau. Can you explain what happened on a national level in your country?
I think in a lot of ways it was a similar narrative, not ideologically similar to what we saw in the U.S. with the move towards Donald Trump. And again, I'm not talking about the ideological swing here, but it was a resistance against the status quo. So Stephen Harper had been in power from 2006 until 2015. Now, that's almost 10 years, which in Canadian terms is a very long time, because he had won an election in 2006, in 2008, again in 2011. So 3 elections he had won, and in a lot of cases, there was just a level of fatigue about it. People just wanted a change, and this happens with a level of regularity in Canadian politics. It's not an uncommon example, but then you get this new, fresh face whose dad was a prime minister back in the 60s and 70s, very ideologically left, and it was throwing out the baby with the bathwater, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's a good insight, again, watching from somewhat of a distance here. Are you surprised, though, with the way Trudeau has gone, or is this exactly what we should have expected?
I'm not surprised at all. In many ways, he's doing exactly what he promised he would do. I mean, the issues he's decided to tackle are issues like legalizing marijuana, like making Canada more of a force with peacekeeping instead of having a robust military. These are things that he's promised. So, I mean, I suppose we can give him some credit for making good on what he said he was going to do, but I don't take solace in that, given that these are fairly dangerous things for a country.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so just back to the bill, the motion M103. In your editorial, you mentioned what happened to Mark Steyn. You mentioned what happened to Ezra Levant. I don't think most Americans are familiar with Ezra Levant and Rebel Media. But what happened, even though ultimately Steyn and Levant emerged victorious, when you have to go through a brutal process and court hearings and fees and that alone is punishment, as you say. But what happened to Ezra Levant over free speech issues?
So both of them, actually, Ezra and Mark Steyn, had very similar trajectories. So what happened was for Ezra Levant, he was the editor of a magazine called the Western Standard, and he published in 2006 the famous Muhammad cartoons, the Jyllands-Posten Muhammad cartoons from Denmark, which mocked the Islamic prophet. And he published it because no one else in Canadian media had published it. Everyone knew there was a controversy, but again, this was before Twitter. This was before you could just pull up an image online as easily. So he ran these images. Muslim groups came up and said, this is offensive, this is discriminatory. They tried to get him criminally prosecuted, but he didn't break any criminal laws. So instead, they went to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. This is what I was telling you about earlier, which allows for subcriminal prosecution. And it doesn't come with the legal protections that you have in court. You're not innocent until proven guilty. You don't have a right to a legal defense necessarily. So what happened is this cost him, I think it was about $150,000 in legal fees, dragged on for years. Even though he emerged as the winner at the end of it, this is not a process that you are allowed to have the protections of a criminal justice system, very similar to Mark Steyn. Now, Mark and Ezra, they've got the willpower in the audience to fight this. A lot of people that human rights commissions have gone after don't have it.
Yeah, and then even so, it is a terrible drain, and it's something that people should not have to go through. There should be some type of protection along the way. It's not just folks like them, though. You mentioned Toronto Sun columnist Tarek Fatah, who said that the anti-Islamophobia motions will target moderate Muslims like himself. So even some Muslims were not happy with this.
No, I mean, Tarek Fatah is one, Salim Mansour, Raheel Raza. These are three very well-known voices in the Canadian Muslim community who are moderate Muslims. They believe in a need to reform Islam. They criticize Sharia law. They criticize niqabs. They criticize the Muslim Brotherhood's infiltration of Canada. And they are, oddly enough, lambasted as Islamophobic for doing it. And their concern is that this approach to Islamophobia will actually stifle necessary discussions about Islam, which are actually being driven by moderate Muslims.
Yeah, and certainly the warnings are here. People need to listen. It's not that Islam is about to take over Canada, but it is amazing how a minority like this can end up being viewed as the victim that needs special protection. Of course, we renounce what happened at the mosque in Quebec, and if there's violence or hatred incited against Muslims, of course we stand against it. But that's just not the norm of what we're dealing with. So, from your vantage point in Canada, if you could speak to us here in America, as you are doing now, what word of wisdom or warning might you give us?
The biggest thing is that the Constitution is not enough of a protection for free speech. We have in Canada, the Constitution guarantees freedom of expression. Now, it's not as robust a defense as the American First Amendment is, but that protection in the Constitution doesn't matter when you have a culture that doesn't recognize free speech, when you have a culture that doesn't recognize there is valid criticism of any group. And this is what we see in the U.S. You've got a First Amendment, but tell people that are being punched in the face at Berkeley that they have a right to free speech. Tell professors that are being threatened with dismissal. Tell people in the media who lose their jobs because they mention an unpopular opinion. They have a First Amendment protection of free speech, but culturally there's this attitude that censorship is where we need to go as a society. And this is why we need to respond not with a legal change, but respond with a cultural renewal to free speech, because that's what we're so sorely lacking.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said, well articulated. Where can folks follow your work, Andrew?
Best place is on Twitter, @Andrew Lawton, and that's the way to get in touch with me for any of the other projects I'm working on.